Section 1 Film Information. True Detective Season 1 was released in 2014. The show was a critical success and currently has an 87% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It was directed by Cary Fukunaga, who was a younger director with numerous highly rated films and TV shows to his credit. The show was written by Nick Pizzolatto, who, prior to True Detective, was a screenwriter for the TV show The Killing. Nick has only been a screenwriter on a single film, The Magnificent Seven, which was released in 2016, 2 years after the first season of True Detective. It seems that Nick's primary focus is True Detective, which allegedly was and is a passion project of his. The protagonists in True Detective are Rust Cohle and Marty Hart, played by Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson respectively. Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson have both been in tons of movies and are well respected within the industry as outstanding actors. Although Matthew McConaughey was known for a long time as the rom-com guy who mostly did really stupid movies, he started to prove that he actually has some acting chops when he started consistently doing more serious roles like the one in True Detective. Rust and his partner Marty are Louisiana State Police detectives who are assigned to a disturbing case involving a young woman who was found posthumously, bizarrely posed in what appears to be a ritualistic and symbolistic murder. The graphic details and specific nature of the case baffle Rust and Marty, who work diligently to solve it. Rust and Marty are very different types of people, with each serving as a counterbalance and sometimes an irritant to the other, but ultimately making excellent partners. Rust is a sort of loose cannon, and Marty is more of an everyman or regular type dude with Anyway, what they uncover in their quest to solve this grisly murder is a sprawling and dark conspiracy with far-reaching implications. Section 2 Diagnosis. Okay, so let's talk diagnosis. Here are some observations I made about Rust throughout the show. He's edgy, intense, dour, introverted, arrogant, judgmental, critical, obsessive, no work-life balance, lack of close friendships, mostly a loner with no family connections. He has a couple of different nicknames, Taxman and Crash. He's a philosophical pessimist and also a hard biological determinist. He has a mysterious and traumatic history. He grew up with his father, a military veteran and survivalist, in Alaska. He was an undercover narcotics officer for 4 years. He has a history of psychiatric hospitalization. He spent 3 months at a place called Northwood Psychiatric Hospital in Texas, which appears to be a fictional place. He claims to have PTSD. He claims to have medical conditions like neurological brain damage and synesthesia, which is a type of hypersensitivity. He's a polysubstance user, beer, cigarettes, synthetic narcotic sedatives or quaaludes, and he uses cocaine while going undercover. He has insomnia, hallucinations, and he seems to be somewhat suicidal. He has some ideation/intent with no identified plan or means. So after carefully considering Rust's behavior and what is revealed about him throughout the show, I actually think that there are 9 different diagnoses that we should consider and explore. PTSD, alcohol use disorder, sedative or hypnotic use disorder, substance or medically induced psychosis, antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder, bipolar disorder, and major depressive disorder. Let's start with PTSD. So this is an impairment that one experiences after undergoing a traumatic event of some sort. And we know that Rust has had many traumatic events in his past, like the death of his daughter, his 4 years undercover, the shootout he experienced, etc. So right away, we can see that he actually doesn't meet criteria B or C. He claims to have flashbacks, but we don't see those in the show. We do see him have hallucinations multiple times, however. But those are different from the flashbacks you usually see in PTSD, which are recurring intrusive memories of the traumatic event. Rust just seems to randomly see weird things. It's entirely possible that he had PTSD at one point, and he may have PTSD under the table that we don't see evidence for in his behavior in the show. But he doesn't seem to display some of the classic PTSD symptoms necessary for the diagnosis right now, so I don't see evidence for a clear, convincing case of PTSD. So that's a no for PTSD. Alcohol use disorder. Okay, so Rust states early on in the show that he is currently not drinking. However, the stress of the case, coupled with the stress of being around Marty's family, results in him drinking again. By the end of the show, Rust is drinking pretty heavily. This diagnosis is debatable, but again, I don't think he fully meets criteria. He's quite functional. He mostly drinks responsibly. He drinks a lot, but it's a purposed amount or an amount he intended to drink. He doesn't seem to drink to get drunk. It doesn't interfere with his work, and he doesn't display withdrawal or tolerance symptoms. So for me, that's a no for alcohol use disorder. Sedative or hypnotic use disorder. Rust seeks out Quaalude several times in the show, but the criteria to be diagnosed with a substance use disorder for this behavior is almost identical to what is required for alcohol use disorder. So again, I don't think Rust meets criteria for the same reasons I already outlined. So that's a no for sedative or hypnotic use disorder. Substance or medically induced psychosis. Basically, like the disorder states, this is a psychosis caused by substances or medical issues. So let's take a look at the criteria. A. Presence of hallucinations or delusions or both. Rust definitely has hallucinations, so that's a check. B. Evidence of the following. B1. Symptoms developed soon after substance intoxication or withdrawal. We know that Rust spent 4 years undercover working narcotics. This required him to indulge in heavy substance use on a regular basis as part of his job duties. We know that he spent 3 months in a psychiatric facility after being released from that assignment following a shootout. We know that he was recovering during that time from a gunshot wound, but that doesn't explain why he was being treated specifically at a psychiatric hospital. We don't know exactly when Rust's psychosis began, but at one point in the show he says that it's a result of neurological damage that he incurred. And given the psychiatric hospital stay after using drugs frequently, we do have evidence that the symptoms probably developed sometime after his 4 years of heavy drug use or during his psychiatric hospitalization. So I feel pretty confident about B1. B2, the substance that was used has the potential to produce psychotic symptoms. Well, Quaalude abuse can cause hallucinations. Cocaine can cause hallucinations. And years of heavy alcohol abuse can result in a condition called alcoholic hallucinosis, which has symptoms that include hallucinations. So that's a yes to B2. C. The disorder is not better explained by a psychotic disorder. Rust doesn't meet criteria for schizophrenia, and he doesn't immediately appear to meet criteria for any of the other disorders that are typically associated with psychosis. So that's a yes to C. D. The symptoms do not exist exclusively during the course of a delirium. Rust has symptoms that occur intrusively and unexpectedly while he's engaging in normal or routine behaviors, meaning they aren't happening during the course of a delirium. So we're good on D. E. The symptoms cause clinically significant distress. Well, considering Rust hallucinates at one of the worst possible times in the last episode when confronting a murder suspect, resulting in the perpetrator stabbing and nearly killing him, I think that could be viewed as a time when his symptoms interfered with his life to an extent that might be viewed as distressing. So that's a yes to E. So Rust meets criteria for substance-induced psychosis. At one point in the show, one of the other detectives refers to Rust as a sociopath. Sociopath used to be in the DSM, but it was removed, and now the closest thing to it is antisocial personality disorder. This disorder mentions classic sociopathy and psychopathy as being included under it. Check out my episode on Nightcrawler or Avengers Infinity War if you want a deeper dive on this disorder. But Rust pretty clearly doesn't meet criteria. He's got empathy, he goes out of his way to help others as evidenced by his commitment to solving the murder case, even after he's no longer a cop. He's concerned about safety as evidenced by his desire to call for backup and bring Marty in on the case to assist in solving it. And he's generally a law-abiding citizen with a few exceptions here and there. Hey, so he sometimes plants evidence and breaks into a corrupt dude's mansions. Nobody's perfect. So to me, he's not a sociopath and he doesn't meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder. So that's a no. Now let's check out narcissistic personality disorder. So Rust doesn't meet this criteria for many of the same reasons he doesn't meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder. Yes, he has some grandiosity, and yes, he thinks highly of his own abilities, but he doesn't require praise. He doesn't think he's necessarily special. He believes he's just another biological puppet who is a slave to their programming. And he does have empathy, like I mentioned earlier. I think Rust is a pretty narcissistic guy in general, or at least he can be, but he doesn't meet criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. So that's another no. Paranoid personality disorder. This has to do with unjustified conspiratorial beliefs. Yes, Rust makes some statements that are a little paranoid at different points throughout the show, and yes, he does believe there is a conspiracy afoot.
We're in a muddy swamp here, man. The alligators are swimming around us, and we don't even know they're there. You know why? Because we don't see them.
I caught zero logic in all that. And that last bit, pure gibberish.
How about we track all the missing persons within 10 miles of every Walmart, huh? Right along the I-10. Why don't we go after Sam Walmart? I'm fixing to pull you for mental exhaustion, man.
But as we learn, he's actually right. There was and is a conspiracy to keep certain vital case information suppressed. Powerful people went to extensive lengths to keep the truth about some murder cases and the identities of some of the perpetrators from coming to light. And Rust even has a moment when he says,
I was aware that I might have lost my mind.
so that means he has some degree of insight and is able to doubt himself. That, combined with what I already stated, pretty soundly disqualifies Rust from paranoid personality disorder. So that's a no. Lastly, let's take a look at a possible mood disorder. At one point in the show, Rust is described as manic, which could suggest a mood disorder like bipolar. But I actually disagree because to me, Rust's presentation is pretty consistent. His behavior, generally speaking, is calm and steady. You don't really see that in those who suffer from untreated bipolar disorder, which include the highs of mania and the lows of deep depression. Kind of like a roller coaster. So you might think that because Rust is so negative, he must be depressed, but I don't really think so on that either. Those with major depressive disorder are usually unmotivated, they have problems with work attendance, they don't typically engage in or enjoy their hobbies, and they experience a feeling of hopelessness. Rust, on the other hand, is incredibly motivated, often going above and beyond his job requirements. He seems incredibly punctual and is described as being responsible in the show. His hobbies include reading crime novels and philosophy, and even though he's negative, that doesn't necessarily mean that he feels hopeless. He's got a cause that drives him, solving the case, and he's completely dedicated to that cause without waver. You typically don't see that in those who have untreated major depression, so I don't really see a good case for a mood disorder. Section 3, Critical Analysis. Okay, so let's analyze the show a bit. First, I have to give props to the show for making such rich, interesting characters. Normally, when I sit down to make one of these episodes, diagnosing the person I'm looking at is pretty straightforward and easy for me. But Rust's presentation is so complex, so nuanced, that finding a proper category for him was especially challenging, which is why I wanted to look at so many different possible diagnoses. He has a few traits or characteristics or behaviors that might cause you to think about a multitude of different disorders. But upon a deeper look, as we just explored, I found that he doesn't fully meet criteria for any of the obvious mental health disorders except substance-induced psychosis. So props to the show for not making this process easy on me. I appreciate the challenge, and I think that that's a sign of a damn good character. Next, Rust mostly subscribes to philosophical pessimism. There are other resources available that go further into this, but Rust believes in some of the ideas presented by philosophers like Schopenhauer or Nietzsche. He believes in Nietzsche's theory of eternal return, as do some of the criminals he confronts. And there are numerous scenes throughout the show with imagery that symbolizes or represents this theory. The basic idea of the theory is that everything that is happening right now has already happened and is destined to continue to happen again and again forever. So time is a circle. But Rust is also a hard biological determinist. That means he believes that free will is an illusion and we are predestined to behave in a manner that is in keeping with our biological programming. The decisions we make are part of an imprinted code that exists in our brains, and we have paths or routes that we follow in life because we are hardwired to do so. And some existential philosophers like Nietzsche didn't believe in free will either. But Rust does contradict himself a bit when he talks about everyone having a choice.
Not to blame you, that wasn't your choice. You were drunk and she made it happen.
Everybody's got a choice, Marty.
So to me, Rust represents a bit of a dichotomy of philosophical positions. But like the show masterfully demonstrates, people are not just one thing or another. They aren't just good or bad. They might be one or the other at different times, but they have the capacity to evolve and change. People have the capacity to be many things, and I think Rust's character is a demonstration of this. The ability to hold two contradictory ideas and take pieces from each of them and be willing to change your position over time is not a weakness. It's actually a sign of intellectual maturity. So yeah, we should all be more like Rust. To me, one of the more interesting things that Rust says is when Marty asks him if he thinks he's a bad man, Rust replies,
World needs bad men. We keep the other bad men from the door.
This reminds me of firefighters who will create smaller, more controlled fires to help mitigate the damage potential of larger fires. It's the idea that sometimes you need to use two negative forces or two forces of the same kind to achieve a positive outcome. Fight fire with fire, two negatives make a positive. It shows that even though Rust is a pessimist and a determinist, he's also a utilitarian. He realizes that he has value. He has a purpose that allows him to maximize his utility in a unique way. I think this is a very important thing that can keep someone motivated, and I think it helps make him a great detective. Also, this idea that you have a bad man helping to protect society from other bad men reminds me of Manhunter or Red Dragon, where the protagonist is basically a man capable of being a serial killer who has chosen to work for the FBI to help catch serial killers rather than act on his impulses or fantasies. A very similar concept also in the show Dexter. Now, despite his negativity, Rust does have principles. For instance, even though Rust made a statement about believing the best thing mankind could do is to end itself, he shows that he believes children have value when he meets with Marty's wife and says that children are the only real purpose for men and women.
Kids are the only thing that matter, Maggie.
Part of this is his biological determinism, but he knows that he has to right the wrongs of wicked men to an even larger degree after he discovers the child pornography photos and video toward the end of the show. He said when referring to the video, no one should have this.
Nobody should have this.
I believe this helps drive him to bring to justice some of the men responsible. And he's also very harsh toward a woman he's interviewing who has murdered her children.
If you get the opportunity, you should kill yourself.
So now let's talk suicidality. Rust has some suicidal thoughts, ideation/intent with no identified plan or means. This is expressed early on in the show when he's talking about his philosophical belief that the best thing mankind can do is to extinguish itself from the planet, and the only thing that keeps him from committing suicide is his weakness to resist the biological programming we all have. However, later in the show, he says that he intends to kill himself, but the one thing stopping him is the case, which he realizes is unresolved. He feels like he has an obligation to solve it, to bring justice before he can self-terminate, but he doesn't identify a plan or means when he's telling this to Marty. Still, now that the case has been solved, they didn't get them all, but like Marty says, they got theirs. I think placing Rust on suicide watch might be appropriate, or at the very least, a trained professional should be having a pretty serious clinical discussion with Rust about his suicidal thoughts. He does display some catharsis at the end when he talks about the feeling he now has that he will be with his deceased daughter and father again in some sort of afterlife. But he says things like, I shouldn't be here, and that he let go, giving in to the darkness and accepting death. So he's initially pretty upset that he's still alive, which should definitely be cause for concern. But maybe with his belief that he will get to experience his lost loved ones again in some way after his time on Earth is finished, and the fact that he now has Marty as a friend, maybe those things will help keep him alive and keep him going. My hope would be that Rust would realize that what he said earlier in the show is correct. The world does need bad men, because bad men can help to keep other bad men from the door. These things combined could instill Rust with a sense of purpose that might help keep him around, even if it's just to bear witness, as he says. That's my hope anyway. He's got value, he's got a very useful skill set, and the world could definitely use a man like him. Okay, enough about Rust. Let's talk about Marty. Marty is often overlooked when people talk about this show, but his character is incredibly important for a variety of reasons. A loud performance like McConaughey's, without a character to balance the equation, would lessen its impact. Marty's tragically flawed nature, which he shows great insight about toward the end of the show, is a representation of the weakness inside of all of us. His imperfections, some more egregious than others, work together with his positive traits to produce an excellent portrait of a human being. And despite where he is on his journey, and despite his flaws, at the end of the day, just like Rust, he will generally try to do the right thing. He might fail, he might be slow to come around sometimes, but he realizes that he has a debt to the victims of these crimes, and despite not being paid to do it, he and Rust pour themselves into setting things right. The final lines of dialogue in the show are really interesting because you have Marty and Rust sort of switching roles. Marty, who is usually optimistic, makes a negative statement about the dark winning in the universe. Rust disagrees with him and says that he thinks the light is winning, because once there was just darkness and no stars, and now we have stars and they seem to be overtaking the darkness. Again, that character growth is just really impressive to me. Now, speaking of growth, let's go in the opposite direction. Marty has an incredible moment of vigilante retribution when he confronts the two young men who were having sex with his underage daughter.
Man's game charges a man's price. Take that away from this, if nothing else.
It's cold and it's wrong on many levels, but it's also incredibly satisfying somehow. That's justice, bro. And you can find a very similar scene in True Detective Season 2 when Colin Farrell's character confronts a school bully. It's not really a good season for the show, and in fact it was a critical disaster, but that sequence of events is incredibly powerful. Definitely check it out, at least to that point, if you haven't already. Lastly, I think people may be a little bit upset if I don't speak at least briefly about the show's primary antagonist. I don't have enough information from the show to give him a proper diagnosis, but he's clearly very disturbed and very foul. He's committed numerous murders and could very well be a classic psychopath who meets criteria for antisocial personality disorder. We don't know much about his history except that he was abused by his father, and childhood abuse is common among those with serious mental health disorders later in life. He's abusive toward animals, belittling toward his sexual partner, which happens to be an incestuous relationship. We know he's been committed to his dark work most of his life. He's methodical, meticulous, and has evaded capture for a long time, partly because he has been protected by powerful members of the community who are involved in a cult with him. He obviously has a lack of empathy and a sinister disregard for human life. He's a proper villain, and the actor who plays him gives a knockout performance, in my opinion, that helps to cement the show as a masterpiece. It's been said that a movie or show is only as strong as its villain, and True Detective gives you a hell of a villain, and it leaves room for other members of the cult to be the focus of future episodes. Section 4, Final Thoughts. So in closing, I think that True Detective is a profound show. I've watched the first season at least 4 times, and each time I go through it, I find new and very interesting things. No other show has touched me quite like True Detective Season 1 has, and I'll admit that I have a deep adoration of the show. The second season is almost universally hated, I think mostly because the first season was so good. It's not great, but there are still some interesting elements about it, and Colin Farrell is especially outstanding like I mentioned earlier. The third season is a return to form, though still not as good as the first season in my opinion. I think the chemistry between the two leads just isn't quite there like it is between Harrelson and McConaughey. The story is pretty interesting and I do like the characters, but being able to match the magic of the first season is a pretty tall order even for the same screenwriter. Sometimes you just can't top your own masterwork. But the first season really does have a special quality that I find mesmerizing. It's just magnetic. And even more fascinating is that it was actually based on a real case. There's some good information about the real case if you want to learn more, including a YouTube documentary I stumbled upon that gets into the details a bit. And it's really interesting stuff. Overall, I can't recommend the show enough. To me, it's simply the best there's ever been, and I doubt I'll ever find anything that can top it. And that does it for this episode. Like my video and subscribe to my channel for future episodes. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like me to analyze and attempt to diagnose any other movie or TV show characters. And I'll see you next time on Psychocinology.